The first thing that stuck with me wasn't a bone or a footprint. It was a camera lens dull with scratches catching a thin blade of sun the way a watch face does when you tilt your wrist. It sat there in a shallow circle of stones too neat for the wind glinting in and out as the clouds slid past. The forest held its breath, and even the ravens kept their distance. Drop your city in the comments and subscribe if stories like this remind you how quickly peace can disappear. I got used to quiet after I left the uniform. In a town like Jackson, quiet has its own shape, the hollow thud of a gas pump handle before dawn tires hissing on wet pavement, and the way elk hooves click on asphalt if you're unlocking your shop too early. Most days I roll the bay doors up at 6, put a pot of coffee on, and watch the glass turn gray to gold as the sun climbs the butte. Summer is the season when people arrive with maps folded like wish letters asking how far is too far, how deep is too deep, and I tell them the same thing I told greenhorns when I wore the badge: the miles are not the risk, the hours are. Out there, time is what unravels you. That first week of June 2022 felt honest and mild. 50 degrees before breakfast, 80 by afternoon. The kind of spread that makes tourists peel off their fleece at noon and ask why they're shivering again at sunset. The river ran high. Snow lines still hung in the gullies above the timber, but the meadows were open, and every day more rental SUVs paraded past my storefront with fly rods and camera tripods rattling in the racks. When the wind came down from the pass, the air smelled like wet dirt and lodgepole pitch. You could close your eyes and know the month by that smell. I still drive the south entrance road when the work is slow. Habit. You spend decades walking people into the wild and walking them back out. You don't stop just because the patch on your shoulder changes. I'll bring a box of donuts to the backcountry office, ask Travis if the radios are behaving, and tease the new rangers about duct tape being a food group. That Monday, I brought a box from the bakery, and the girl behind the counter warned me the bear claws were still warm. Good, I told her. Rangers think better with sticky fingers. At the counter up at the office, the big ledger sat open like always: date, party, size, route, return. A simple promise in blue ink. Travis flipped through pages with a pen tucked behind his ear, scanned a permit or two, and told me the thoroughfare was drying fast but still messy. The thoroughfare, those back miles that make a person feel like the map is folded wrong. Most folks never reach it. It's not a postcard view. It's space. The long kind. I first met Lena the season before standing out in the parking lot with a camera strap crossing her chest like a seatbelt. She had the posture of a person used to carrying weight not muscle-bound, just steady like the pack and her were old friends. She asked me if I'd ever photographed sandhill cranes near the Madison, and then laughed because my answer was a weather report, not a yes or no. We crossed paths twice that summer, once at the South Gate, once at a dusty pullout where the view wasn't much unless you knew how to frame it. We didn't talk long, but I remember her eyes not eager in the way beginners are. Clear. She listened the way some people listen to music with their mouths closed and their shoulders loose. On June 11th, a Saturday, I saw her again at the grocery in Jackson, of all places, in the aisle where they tuck the camp soap and water filters. She was shuffling her cart with her hip and reading the back of a stove fuel can like the fine print might change midsummer. She recognized me first. We talked about the snowfields that hang in the cuts north of the Snake, and how the wind can make a 60-degree day feel like 40 if you stop moving too long. She told me she wanted 2 quiet weeks, no deadlines, no clients, just clean air and straight lines. I nodded and told her that in June the air is good company, but the lines are never straight. Her cart was sensible oatmeal packets, almonds, a box of tea jerky in the plain brown wrapper, not the candy kind, 2 new socks in the shade they call forest, and a roll of fluorescent tape. She bought a road atlas too, which made me smile. Everyone trusts their phone until the bars are gone. At the register, she paid cash for a couple items and card for the rest, like she wanted to leave a small paper trail but not a full one. Some travelers are like that, private without being secretive. Outside, I watched her fit the bags into the back of a blue Subaru by habit. more than curiosity. She tucked the fragile things under a fleece and slid a guidebook into the door pocket. Then she stood with her hands on the lift gate and breathed like a runner. It wasn't nerves. It was the ritual of starting. Back at the shop that afternoon, a couple from Ohio wanted a tire plug and directions to a spot with fewer people. I gave them both, then changed the oil on a ranch truck that had seen more mud than road for 3 years running. In the lull, I called Travis, told him I'd swing by at dawn to drop off a box of spare valve cores, the kind that rattle right out of bike tires on washboard road. We traded old jokes about welcome to June weather that thin ice-tone seasoned rangers use when the forecast looks fine and you still expect hail. On the counter, my coffee cooled into the color of creek water under shade. I thought about the Subaru and the woman who had stood a little too long with her palms spread on the liftgate. Not worry. Just a single frame stuck in the mind the way certain trail switchbacks stay with you for no real reason. Early Sunday, I drove north with the heater on low and the window cracked the dashboard thermometer holding at 48 degrees F, even as sun painted the top edges of the pines. The south entrance was waking up a line of cars, good-natured impatience kids leaning out of windows counting bison that weren't there yet. In the backcountry office, the coffee was strong enough to make your ears ring. Travis handed me a pen and told me to write my cell on the volunteer list in case we needed another mule. That's what he calls anyone with a good back and bad boundaries. I lingered by the register because old habits don't die. They retire to a smaller pasture. The names on those pages tell the story of a place more clearly than a brochure where people hope to go when they expect to find their way back. In the middle of the page for June 12th, there was a neat hand, not the block letters you get from college groups, a looped cursive with a photographer's patience. Whitaker L. Party Size 1, Route South Entrance to Thoroughfare Loop 14 days. Emergency contact, the same Boulder number I already recognized from permit seasons when I'd still pull Saturday shifts. I didn't say anything to Travis. You learn not to narrate the ordinary. He stamped 2 permits, answered a question about creek crossings, and reminded a guy from Bakersfield that 100 feet is the law for bison. We all smiled the way you do when you've repeated a sentence 1,000 times and still mean it. By mid-morning, the light got hard and the pines threw thin shadows. I stood out by the trailhead and watched a spread of hikers take shape the clump that walks too fast, the loner who adjusts their straps 3 times, the photographer who lifts a lens, lowers it, lifts it again. Lena came through steady. No theatrics, pack riding clean on her hips, the top strap snug, the whole load balanced the way an old ranger notices and respects. She waved with her wrist, not a showy gesture, just a good morning you felt more than saw. I raised my coffee cup and told her to keep an eye on the sky after 3. The wind had been kicking up and those meadow storms roll in like someone dragging a bedsheet over the sun. She smiled like a person who keeps mental notes on a shelf and went on. People imagine a gateway into wilderness is a grand thing, trumpets a crest in the land, some archway you pass under. Mostly it's a line where the smell of exhaust thins and the sound softens until it's just the click of trekking poles and the brush of fabric on bark. You feel it more than see it. She crossed that line, and the sound of her steps folded into the bigger quiet that always waits out there. I stood long enough to finish the coffee, and then I went back to the office to give Travis grief about the state of the first aid bin. That afternoon, the wind did exactly what I warned about. By 3:15, clouds stacked into a gray wall over the ridge toward the Idaho line. Gusts came through like somebody slapping the side of a tent. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 10 minutes, the way June does when it wants to remind you that calendars don't run the park. I watched a family hustle back to their SUV, laughing, the mother counting heads as she slammed doors, the father making a joke about hot chocolate. In the backcountry office, the radio chatter was routine. A ranger calling a plate that didn't match a hang tag, a maintenance crew asking for someone to sign off on a culvert. Nothing raised voices, nothing rare. I drove home before dinner, took the long way so I could look at the river. Ospreys were working the eddies head-down wings in a tight V until the drop. At my shop, The answering machine had 2 messages, one from a ranch hand asking about mud chains and one from Greg Whitaker in Boulder. His voice careful and polite, asking about stove gaskets that fit an older white fuel burner. Said his older daughter liked that kind of thing. Didn't trust piezo igniters. I called him back after I closed the bay doors, gave him the part number and a link to a Wyoming outfitter that still stocks them. He thanked me twice in that formal way fathers do when they're admitting they don't quite speak their kids' language, but love them enough to learn a phrase or two anyway. I hung up, looked at the light dying off the butte, and felt a small, harmless ache pride mixed with the tug you feel when a stranger's care for their child lands squarely on your own memory. The next day looked the same on paper and completely different in the air. Some mornings the sky over the park sits too still like a pond. Before you notice, nothing's swimming. I drove up again with a bag of bolts for an old trailhead sign, told a story about lightning and aluminum tent poles to a couple of interns, and checked the forecast taped to the corkboard. It promised more wind, a chance of late showers, and pleasant temperatures for early week. The kind of words that make people smile and toss the rain jacket deeper into the pack. In the lot, the blue Subaru sat 3 spaces down from the garbage corral. Clean, not shining, just properly kept. A soft layer of road dust dulled the hood, and a map pocketed behind the passenger glass showed a pink line drawn with care so the turnings stood out like veins. My own truck reflected dim in the door. I moved on because no one needs an old man taking inventory of their car on a public lot. By midweek, town had settled into the summer rhythm. Drift boats at dawn, mountain bikes at dusk. The lazy noon hour when everything pauses because people forgot to drink water. The hardware clerk down the block sold out of tent stakes again, and I told him to stop under-ordering just because the catalog makes the box look big. We put a new timing belt on a Sprinter van whose owner wanted to know if his rig could handle ruts, and I told him ruts could handle his rig just fine if he brought bad judgment. There's a way places like this train you to speak gently and not say less. In the evenings, I sit on the shop's back steps with a sandwich and watch the light lift off the Tetons like steam. Even when the road is busy, there's a minute every day when the traffic slackens and you can hear the crickets over the tires. That week, that minute hit just after 8. I'd find myself counting taillights as they went north, then counting again as they came south. Old game, no prize. It's a way of reading the day's pulse after the fact. How many went in? How many came out? You never keep score aloud, but your bones keep it. On Friday night, a little after 9, I drove the south entrance one more time. No errand, just a restlessness that comes in early summer when the snow is still in the shade and the meadows are buzzing. The backcountry office porch light throws a cone that catches moths like a gentle net. Travis leaves it on out of habit, he says, as if the light were a promise instead of a bulb. I parked across from the trail register, stepped out into the thin chill, and listened to the wind slip through the lodge poles. A distant vehicle door thumped. Somewhere down near the river, a beaver slapped the surface sharp as a hand clap. On the ledger, the week's pages lay open under a paperweight shaped like a trout. Names came and went in tidy lines. Pencil check marks next to easy out and backs. A couple of crossed-out plans where snow still blocked the passes. I found the page from Sunday without meaning to. The ink had dried into the fibers so cleanly you could feel it with your fingertip. Whitaker L. party size. 1. Return date. A neat number, set. 2 Sundays ahead. I stood there longer than made sense. Listening for nothing in particular, counting the seconds between gusts, like I could hear the barometer moving. The moths battered themselves against the porch glass. The bulb hummed softly. I closed the ledger and set the trout back where it belonged. Across the lot, that blue Subaru waited in the same spot it had chosen days earlier, nose pointed toward the timber as if it knew the road in, but not the way out. I locked the door to the office and left the porch light burning. That Friday night ended the way so many do around here. Quiet road porch light left burning a sky so wide it almost feels like it's listening. I went to bed with the smell of rain in the air, and the low hum of the fridge for company. Nothing felt wrong yet. Not then. But by the next morning, that blue Subaru hadn't moved. It sat in the same spot across from the backcountry office, the same streak of dust across its windshield, the same line of spruce needles caught in the wiper. You don't think much of that at first. Hikers leave their cars all the time. Some come back late, some extend their routes, some just forget to check out at the desk. But by the fourth morning, something in me began to itch. Travis stopped by my shop for a patch kit around noon that day. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from looking at the same thing too long. I poured him a cup of coffee and asked if the Subaru still belonged to that photographer, the one with the green jacket. He nodded once and said, "Still no sign out." Then he added, almost to himself, "She had 14 days. She's past 16 now." He didn't make a show of it, didn't sound an alarm, just folded the paper napkin from under his cup and left it in a neat square on the counter. I watched him drive off toward the ranger station with that old familiar tension between duty and dread riding shotgun. That evening, the first search team assembled. No sirens, no media, just quiet, steady preparation. A couple of rangers saddled up the mules, others loaded packs with satellite radios and thermal blankets. Travis called me in, asked if I still knew how to ride a line. I did. We set out early the next morning, before the light reached the valley, the horse's breath puffing white in the chill. The forest held the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. We reached the mouth of Fox Creek by mid-morning, and that's where we found the first trace, a single boot print in soft mud, narrow and clean, a woman's tread facing uphill. Not far from it, tucked beneath a log, lay a crumpled wrapper from an energy bar, the same brand I'd seen her toss in her cart back in Jackson. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it felt close enough to tighten the air between us. We followed the creek another mile, the kind of country where the trail blurs into swamp and meadow. No campfire rings, no broken twigs, no drag marks. Just the long hum of mosquitoes and the hiss of water cutting around the stones. After 2 hours, the print vanished into fir needles and the rain began. When we got back to base that night, the storm broke, fully lightning striking somewhere north, thunder rolling slow like it was dragging its feet. I sat under the tin awning of the equipment shed listening to the rain pound the gravel and thought about that boot print. A clean impression in wet earth means the foot wasn't there long before the next rain. It also means she was still moving on her own, at least for the first couple days. But after that, no one knew. The next morning they brought in the helicopter. It lifted off heavy, its blades pushing the air down so hard the dust stung our faces. From the ridge I watched it shrink to a dark insect in the distance, tracing slow arcs over the basins. Hours later it came back empty. The search expanded to horseback and foot. Every evening we returned, soaked and scratched, a little quieter than before. The wilderness gives nothing easy. By the end of the week, the Air Patrol reported a pale shape near Open Creek, a flash of nylon half buried under pine duff. We hiked in the next morning. The climb took half a day through slick rock and bog. When we reached the clearing, the wind died as if someone had closed a door. There it was, a small tent, weathered but intact, staked tight against the ground. The flap hung half open. Inside, a sleeping bag lay zipped halfway, a pair of boots placed side by side on the nylon floor. No signs of struggle. No sign of her. Her pack leaned against a fallen log like it had been set there with care. A few things still inside, some trail mix, a first aid kit, a folded map creased from use. But the journal and the satellite phone, both listed on her permit inventory, were gone. The air smelled like old smoke and rain-soaked ash. 10 paces from the tent, someone had carved into the bark of a lodgepole. Not initials, not a date, just a circle cut deep with 3 vertical slashes through it, clean lines, recent sap still bleeding. Travis took a photo and marked the coordinates. I remember how he stared at it, his jaw tight. We camped nearby that night, though none of us slept much. Around midnight, wind tore through the trees, knocking down a branch that startled the mules. The radio crackled once with static and went dead for a full minute. I lay in my tent, listening to the forest breathe. There's a rhythm to it. The creak of trunks, the drip of water, the low moan of wind through narrow passes, but that night it felt uneven, like the beat was missing a note. The next morning, a decision came down to scale back. We'd covered nearly 20 miles of terrain with nothing new to show. Rain had erased what little trace might have been left. The mountain streams ran high with meltwater, and even the dogs lost the scent. By the 12th day of the official search, the case shifted from rescue to recovery, though no one wanted to say the word out loud. Her name was entered into the federal missing persons system. You tell yourself it's just procedure, but every ranger knows what it means. The posters go up, the press releases shrink to a paragraph, and the phone in the station rings a little less each day. Families still call, though. They always do. Greg called the station once while I was there. His voice had that flat calm of a man trying to hold the world steady with his own will. He asked if the weather would clear, if new technology could scan denser tree cover, if bears ever drag away gear. I told him the truth sometimes, yes, but not often this far south, not without a mess. He thanked me anyway. As July wore on, the story grew legs outside the park. The name thoroughfare turned up in forums, the kind of online chatter that mixes half-truth with folklore. Somebody mentioned the zone of death, a patch of legal limbo along the Idaho edge where no jury could technically be called. I'd heard that one for years, old campfire law twisted into myth. But now folks said maybe someone knew about the loophole used it. I heard theories about hermits' cults, hidden caves. None of it fit what I'd seen. The tent told me something else, discipline, precision control. Whoever set it up wasn't running from anything. By August, the park quieted down. Tourists drifted home, and the storms came heavier in the afternoons. One evening, a hunter came into the south entrance post, mud up to his knees, eyes wide. He claimed he'd seen a figure walking a ridge near Heart Lake barefoot, arms out like she was balancing. Wasn't walking, he said. More like floating. Travis noted it, but didn't file a full report. People see things in that kind of isolation. Fog bends, light, wind moves, grass. The mind fills the gaps. Still, he and I both drove out the next morning and glassed the ridge for hours. Nothing moved but the clouds. A week later, a photographer camping north of Beckler River mentioned strange lights flickering at dawn, blue and rhythmic. Not like lightning, not like any gear he knew. He said they breathed. I'd spent enough nights out there to know how reflections play tricks. But when a third report came, an old trapper swearing he'd seen a woman in a green coat walking between two tall, pale figures who left no prints. It got harder to shrug off. He said he packed his things that night and moved closer to town after 30 years alone in those woods. Whatever's out there, he told Travis it don't like being found. By the time September rolled around, the nights were cold enough to freeze the top layer of puddles. We closed the search officially. Paperwork boxes, evidence bags, sealed and dated. I stood on the porch of the ranger office as Travis locked the door. The light caught his face in a way that made him look older. "It keeps her," he said quietly. "This place keeps her." I didn't argue. Back in Jackson, life shrank to its ordinary size again. Tires to fix coffee, to pour talk about elk migration and early snow. But the park's silence followed me. Some nights I'd find myself driving the old South Road just to see the gate to know it still stood where it should. I told myself it was habit, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't stop thinking about that tent, those boots neatly placed, and the empty space between them. A week before winter's first snow, I stopped by the south entrance one last time. The porch light still burned over the ledger desk. I flipped through the book, the pages cool under my fingertips. Her name remained where she'd written it months earlier. Ink unblurred, steady as if waiting for the line that never came. Whitaker L. 14 days. I left the book open to her page. Outside, the wind carried the first flakes sideways across the parking lot, tapping against the Subaru's windshield, still sitting exactly where she'd left it. I brushed the snow from the hood and looked out toward the tree line. The forest stood dark and still. But in that stillness was a sound soft, almost like breath, rolling down from the ridge. Could have been wind through the pines. Could have been something else. I didn't wait to decide. I locked the gate, turned the truck south, and let the headlights carve two thin paths through the falling snow, not knowing that come spring those woods would finally speak again. Snow was already in the air by the time the Whitaker family stopped calling the station every day. It's the quiet season then, roads, half-empty sky low and gray, the kind of weather that makes the park fold in on itself. We all felt it. Travis went back to routine patrols. The search boards came down, but her name never left the whiteboard. It just got moved to the side like an unfinished sentence waiting for the right words. I drove up less often after that, though. Every time I passed the south gate, I'd slow down eyes on that lot. The Subaru stayed there until the first big snow when they finally towed it to storage. There was something final about that. A clean windshield again, tires half buried in powder, a tag hanging from the rearview mirror that read simply, "Hold for evidence." Winter ran long that year. When you live up here, you mark time by the color of the valley gray in December, bone white through February blue again by April when the melt starts to show gravel on the road. Somewhere in that stretch, the story of Lena's disappearance started to grow legs beyond Wyoming. A few local papers ran short pieces, then a Denver station picked it up. By the time March rolled in, there were podcasts and message boards all chewing on it, twisting it into something unrecognizable. They called it the Yellowstone Zone case, or worse, the Zone of Death mystery. I remember hearing that phrase for the first time over the radio while changing oil on a snowplow. The reporter said it with a kind of practiced chill, like it was a campfire story instead of a family's grief. The zone they were talking about is real, though not in the way those stories made it sound. It's just a thin strip of Idaho land inside the park boundary, a bureaucratic tangle that means technically no one lives there, so no local jury could be formed. It's the kind of legal oddity lawyers like to argue over, not the kind of place anyone builds a myth around. But people love a mystery, especially one they can't touch. They drew maps, compared old disappearances, said maybe someone was using that loophole on purpose, some unseen hand taking advantage of the system's blind spot. To them, Lena wasn't a person anymore. She was a headline, a theory, a warning. That spring, when the snow still crusted the edge of the timber, I ran into a retired trapper named Amos Green at a feed store outside Afton. He'd spent 3 decades up in the backcountry, lived off the grid longer than most people stay married. We talked about gas prices, coyotes, the usual small talk until he set his coffee down and said, "You remember that photographer girl, the one who went missing up north?" I said, "I did." He looked down at his hands a long moment before saying, "I seen her. Or I think I did." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. He told me he'd been checking lines near Beckler River back in July, the same week the official search ended. Claimed he saw a woman walking with 2 people on a game trail at dusk. Tall ones, he said, pale like birch trunks, barefoot. They moved quiet, too quiet, and the woman followed them like she was half asleep. Now, Amos wasn't the type to chase stories. He'd lived too long with only his own shadow for company. I asked what he did after that. He said he went home, packed his things, and moved his cabin closer to the main road. I wanted to ask more, but his eyes said he was done talking. When I told Travis later, he only sighed. We logged a dozen of those he said meaning sightings that don't add up, but none of them had that look in their eyes when they told it. By late April, the trails opened again. Most of the snow had gone, though you could still find it packed under the trees. The thoroughfare remained closed for maintenance, at least that was the official line. Between us, everyone knew it was because no one wanted to walk back in there yet. Too much had happened, or too little. Hard to say which way's more. I took on a few contract jobs near the South Road that month, fixing old park equipment, helping clear trail debris. That's how I met a young biology student from the University of Montana working on a drone survey for elk migration. She was new to the park, bright-eyed, curious in that clean slate kind of way. We talked about the thoroughfare once, and she said softly, "That's where the signal dropped, right?" She knew the story. Everyone did. I nodded and told her the same thing I'd told others. Yeah, somewhere around Open Creek. On the 3rd of April the following year, the call came in from the station. Faint signal. Metallic reflection coordinates logged just west of where her last GPS ping had been. I remember the air that day. It was thin and sharp, the snow melting so fast the runoff made rivers of the road. They thought it was debris at first, old camping gear, maybe a piece of survey equipment. But protocol said check it, so they sent a small team out. I tagged along, part habit, part something else I couldn't name. The hike in was slow. Meltwater made the ground slick, and every step sounded like a boot on soaked paper. The air smelled like wet moss and rust. We reached a low rise where the drone's reflection had been marked. At first glance, it just looked like another patch of thawing ground, tangled branches, ice clinging to roots. Then, as the sun cut through, a glint flashed near a ring of stones. Travis crouched first, brushing aside a thin crust of snow, and there it was. A camera lens, scratched half buried, catching the light like an eye opening after a long sleep. We found more as we cleared the area. A ring of stones, near perfect in shape, the soil inside blackened from an old fire. In the middle, small fragments that at first looked like bone, though none of us wanted to say it aloud. To the side, a green jacket folded neatly, as if waiting for its owner to come back. I remember that part most, the care in it, the precision. You can tell a lot about a person from how they leave things behind. This wasn't panic. It was ceremony. We radioed for backup. Within hours, the site was cordoned off and marked for forensic recovery. Helicopters came in again, quieter this time, their shadows sliding across the trees like ghosts. The snow was still patchy enough that every shovel of dirt steamed under the sun. Beneath one drift, we found her hiking poles collapsed and tucked together like someone had taken the time to put them to rest. There was no sign of the camera body, only the lens and the memory card slot empty. Over the next 2 days, forensic teams expanded the perimeter, following a faint pattern of disturbed ground. Small piles of stone bits of cloth turned gray by weather. By the 3rd morning, they'd mapped out what we later called the clearing. I wasn't prepared for what we saw there. It wasn't horror in the usual sense, no violence, no blood. It was the order of it that froze you. Her remains had been arranged in a spiral precise as a compass, bones cleaned by time and placed in widening rings that curved outward. The skull rested at the center, tilted upward, mouth open just enough to look like breath had been caught mid-sentence. Around the spiral, 6 trees bore carvings, the same mark we'd seen at her old camp, a circle with 3 lines cut through. Each mark faced inward, angled toward the spot where her skull lay. The rangers called for specialists, archaeologists, even a cultural liaison to determine if it matched any known symbol. None of them could say for sure. The spacing was too exact to be random. The radius matched measurements from ancient ceremonial structures found half a world away. But this was Yellowstone, not some buried ruin. When I first stepped into that clearing, it felt wrong to speak. The air was still unnaturally so. Even the wind seemed to move around it, not through it. One ranger switched off his radio without realizing it. Another leaned over and whispered, "She didn't die here." He was right. There were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no broken branches leading in or out. It was as if the woods had closed behind whoever brought her there. The investigation turned clinical after that: photographs, laser scans, samples labeled and sealed. But the people doing the work weren't immune. One young tech vomited behind a tree after her first hour on scene. Another refused to stay past sundown. You can teach procedure, but you can't train for that kind of quiet. When the news reached Boulder, I heard from Greg again. He didn't say much, just that the park had called that they were bringing her home. I wanted to say something comforting, something true, but all I could manage was, "She's not lost anymore." He thanked me, voice breaking, and hung up. That night, I sat in my truck by the entrance gate long after everyone had gone. The floodlights from the ranger station threw long shadows across the lot. I kept seeing that spiral every time I closed my eyes, the care in it, the patience. Whether she built it or someone else did it, had purpose. You could feel it in your chest, like a slow, steady heartbeat. When I finally started the engine, snow had begun again, a light flurry drifting down, catching in the headlights, melting before it hit the ground. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called low and distant. I thought of Lena's last words in her journal, the ones they found later, the ones no one outside the investigation knew yet. I won't repeat them now, not yet. But they changed everything we thought we understood about what happened in that clearing. As I drove home that night, the road slick and black under the snow, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The park hadn't kept her after all. It had only been waiting until it was ready to let her be found. And in the months that followed, what that discovery uncovered would reach far beyond one woman's disappearance. It would make all of us question what else the wilderness remembers and what it chooses to return. They brought the remains out on the 5th morning after the discovery. I remember the sound of the helicopter more than anything, the slow thunder of the rotors echoing off the basin walls, snow lifting in soft spirals around the landing zone. Everyone stood back as the stretcher came through. There's something about watching a person's story reduced to a tarp and straps that takes the words right out of you. I'd seen recoveries before, but this one carried a stillness I can't explain. The forest itself seemed to be listening. Once the site was sealed, I drove down to the base camp to help catalog what they'd found. Paperwork, photos, inventory, the dull, necessary work that keeps chaos from swallowing truth. They spread Lena's things across a long table inside a tent. Her jacket folded the same way we'd seen it. Her boots wiped clean by time, the lens, the hiking poles, the fragments of a journal still damp and warped from the thaw. A few rangers hovered nearby, whispering like the canvas walls might be listening. Someone said the analysts had found geometric precision in the bone pattern down to the inch. Someone else said the symbols on the trees aligned perfectly with sunrise. I kept my mouth shut and just wrote down tag numbers. That night, a cold wind moved down from the ridge, shaking the tents until the lanterns swayed. Travis sat beside me at the mess table, hands clasped tight around his coffee. "We'll be questioned for years over this," he said quietly. "Doesn't matter what we find, it'll never be enough." He wasn't wrong. By morning, news had leaked. Drones, spirals, bones arranged like a map. The words ritual and cult were already bouncing around the internet before breakfast. A week later, they found something that pushed the whole case sideways. Just past the clearing, under a small stack of stones someone swore hadn't been there the first day, was a military ammo can. Rusted, sealed tight, cold to the touch. Inside, wrapped in canvas, was her leather journal. I was there when they opened it. The smell hit first earth-damp paper, a trace of mold. Her handwriting started neat and crisp, the same looping script I remembered from the backcountry logbook. The early entries were almost mundane weather notes, light conditions, animal tracks. Then, somewhere around the middle, her tone shifted. "I hear them when the sun is low," she wrote. "It's not madness they're teaching me." The next pages were full of sketches, trees bending inward circles within circles, something she called the source. She described sitting still at night, listening to vibrations rising through the ground like a hum under the crust of the earth. I turned each page carefully, my hands sweating inside the gloves. One paragraph stopped me cold. The clearing was already here, she'd written. I just had to remember it. There were other passages, stranger still. It only listens at dawn, she said in one. The spiral is not for them. It's for it. The last pages had holes worn clean through from pressure she'd drawn the same spiral again and again until the ink bled through 4 sheets. The final entry ended mid-sentence, the pen line trailing into white space like a breath that never finished. The analysts read it all. They called it an episode of collapse brought on by isolation. Maybe that's what it was, but the precision of that spiral, the care in every placement, it didn't feel like collapse to me. It felt deliberate. She wasn't lost when she died. She was trying to communicate, though I don't think any of us were the ones she meant to reach. After the journal, old voices started resurfacing. Retired rangers came forward with memories they'd long tucked away other odd finds in that same backcountry circles of stones footprints that stopped mid-trail a walking stick wrapped in deer sinew. One man, Harold Eastman, came up from Idaho Falls to speak with investigators. He'd served here in the 70s. Said he once found a campsite arranged just as carefully, but with white stones laid in a crescent. They told me to write it up as abandoned property, he said, staring into his coffee. I never went back. Then came a park historian, Dr. Eliza Markham, who brought photocopies of maps from the 1940s sections of the same valley marked with strange notations about geothermal anomalies and missing surveyors. She pointed out that 6 hikers had vanished there during those years, all near the same latitude. Their campsites were never found, but scattered reports described items arranged in perfect geometry. I could see the unease ripple through the room as she spoke. We were rangers, not archaeologists, but something about her calm certainty made the skin crawl on the back of my neck. Later, one of the Shoshone cultural advisors visited the station. He didn't bring charts or reports. He just said, "That place has a rhythm. You don't walk it unless you're invited." His eyes didn't linger long on any of us. He wasn't being dramatic. He was stating a fact, the kind that comes from generations of remembering. The further they dug, the more it felt like we were staring through a keyhole into something older than law or logic. The forest up there didn't feel wild anymore. It felt aware. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that spiral. The thought kept me up nights. If she hadn't built it for herself, who had? A month after the recovery, Travis asked me to accompany him to Boulder. The family wanted to meet with someone who'd been on site. I almost said no. There's no good way to tell parents what the ground does to a body, or how a place can look beautiful and terrible at once. But I owed them the truth, at least what little of it we had. Their home sat in a quiet neighborhood, all cottonwoods and cracked sidewalks. Greg answered the door, his face drawn but polite. June didn't come out right away. When she finally did, she looked at me like I carried something she needed but couldn't bear to touch. Maddie sat across from me on the couch, a thin folder in her lap, the official report. She didn't open it. Instead, she slid a small envelope across the table. Inside were copies of unsent emails she'd found in Lena's drafts folder. Phrases I already knew from the journal. The trees bow inward. The source is calling. One line caught me off guard. You'll understand when you see the clearing. Greg asked the question I'd been dreading. Was she afraid I wanted to give him something clean, something simple, but all I could say was, no. Not the way we think of fear. He nodded once and looked down at his hands. June started to cry without sound. Maddie just whispered, she wasn't running from something. She was walking toward it. We left quietly, the way you leave a room after prayer. Outside, dusk had fallen, and the air smelled faintly of rain on hot pavement. Travis didn't speak until we reached the truck. She built her own ending, he said finally. Whatever it was, she chose it. Back in Wyoming, the park sealed the clearing for good. They called it a geothermal hazard zone, filed it under maintenance and safety. But everyone who'd been there knew it wasn't about hazards or safety. It was about Respect Fear's quieter cousin, The spiral still lingered in the soil, faint, but visible like a fingerprint pressed into time. As weeks passed, stories began again. Hikers claiming to see lights pulsing in rhythm above the basin. A guide swore he heard humming from the trees at dusk, like a woman's voice echoing through the timber. Most of it got brushed off as imagination or hysteria stirred by online speculation, but one report came across my desk that I still can't shake. A seasoned backpacker found a small stack of stones near Beckler Meadows, 6 pieces each carved with a tiny spiral burned into the face. He thought it was graffiti until he noticed the ashes around it, perfectly circular, no sign of a fire. When he handed me the stone, I felt its weight smooth and warm despite the cool air. I turned it over once, twice, then set it back down. "You should probably leave that here," I told him. He didn't argue. He left the station in silence, and I never saw him again. Some nights I drive up near the south boundary just to see the glow of the park lights fade behind me. The woods look peaceful from a distance, a single black line against the sky. But I know better. There are places in Yellowstone where the map ends, where the land folds over on itself and keeps its own memory. Lena found one of those places, and whatever she met out there, whether it was madness or meaning, didn't end with her. I can't prove it, but I think the forest still remembers her footsteps. Sometimes when the wind shifts, I swear I hear it soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Maybe it's just air moving through the trees. Maybe not. But next spring, when the snow melts off the ridge again, someone will see something glint in the thaw, and the whole story will start over. Because that's what this place does. It keeps what it's given, and it's never done giving. It's been 2 years now since we closed the site, and even after all this time, the memory of that place hasn't softened. The forest still holds the same shape in my mind. The slant of the pines. The cold press of silence before dawn. The smell of ash when the air turns wet. But the edges of the story have changed. Time does that. It dulls the shock, not the truth. The official word is that Lena's case is resolved. The reports use phrases like no criminal evidence and environmental exposure words designed to calm what can't really be explained. But for those of us who were there, that never felt like an ending. It felt like a pause, a breath the earth took and never quite let go. The family accepted her remains in the spring. The funeral was small, quiet, and private, just as they wanted. I was there standing toward the back, beneath a cottonwood tree that creaked in the wind. Greg read a few words, hands trembling only once. June never spoke, just placed a small spiral she'd drawn on paper against the urn. Maddie stayed still beside her, watching the way light moved across the hillside. When it was over, they didn't invite speeches or cameras. They just wanted to go home. After the service, I stopped by the trailhead near Boulder where they planned to scatter her ashes. It was one of her favorite spots, a ridge that overlooks the valley where the morning sun first hits. I didn't say anything out loud, just stood there long enough to feel the wind cut through the grass and the hum of cicadas under it. Sometimes that's all you can do for the dead, be still long enough for the silence to notice. Back in Wyoming, the park issued its final statement. The thoroughfare clearing was now a restricted thermal study zone closed indefinitely to the public. The spiral had eroded in the thaw, but pieces remained, the faint groove of bone dust mixed with soil, a few symbols scarred into bark that never fully healed. They fenced it off, left a single wooden sign that reads, "Sensitive habitat. Do not enter." That's government language for let it rest. But the stories didn't rest. A month after the site was sealed, hikers started reporting strange things again. Lights drifting low through the trees, soft sounds at night that seemed to echo words, a humming that came and went with the wind. At first, we chalked it up to imagination. The human mind tries to fill gaps it doesn't understand. But some of those hikers weren't tourists. They were rangers, seasoned people who'd walked that land their whole lives. One of them, a friend named Cal, told me he saw a shape at dusk near Open Creek, a figure standing between two trees unmoving. He called out thinking it was a lost hiker, but when he took another step, it was gone. He said the air smelled like burned sage and metal. He doesn't talk about it anymore. By autumn, the theories came back in waves: paranormal investigators, amateur sleuths, online forums claiming Lena had been part of something ancient or forbidden. None of it sat right with me. The woman I met was grounded, thoughtful, deliberate. If she was chasing anything out there, it wasn't fame or madness. It was meaning. I think she believed the wilderness could answer something the rest of us forgot how to ask. Maybe she was wrong. Or maybe she got closer to the answer than she could bear. The last piece of evidence to surface came from her sister Maddie. She'd been combing through the digital archives trying to recover the missing camera files. It took months, but a fragment was recovered, a single image from the camera's internal cache. It wasn't the forest or a landscape. It was the sky. Taken from the ground, looking straight up, framed by trees, bent slightly inward, as though bowing. The timestamp matched the final day in her journal. The photo wasn't bright or ominous, just soft gray light breaking through the canopy and something faint in the middle of it. A reflection, maybe, or a shape. No one could decide. I remember sitting in the lab when they projected that image on the screen. The room went quiet. Travis leaned forward, squinting at the center of it, then whispered, "She was looking up when she took it." That detail sat with me for weeks. The idea of her lying in that clearing camera in hand, eyes fixed on the sky as if waiting for the forest to breathe back. In time, people moved on. New cases came, new storms, new summers. The park repaired trails, replaced signage, filled the gaps that stories leave behind. But not all of us could step away so easily. I still visit her father every now and then when I'm in Colorado. He keeps a small framed photo on his workbench, the one she took years before a sunrise over the Tetons. It's faded from sun exposure, but the light still glows in that quiet way early light does. He told me once I used to think she went out there to escape the world. Now I think she went looking for proof it was still worth saving. I didn't have an answer for that. I just nodded. Because in some ways he's right. The wilderness tests us. It strips away everything easy and leaves you with what's true. Some people find peace in that. Some people disappear. Every now and then I still drive up toward the south entrance just to sit at the overlook. The road winds higher than most tourists ever see, where the pines thin out and the wind cuts cold even in summer. From there you can see miles of open valley, the kind of distance that swallows sound. Sometimes, if the light hits just right, you can spot the outline of that basin far off, a pale scar against the dark trees. I don't stop long, just enough to remind myself she was real, that the story isn't just myth whispered over campfires. I retired for good last year. The uniform's in the closet, the radio long turned in. My days now are quieter, helping neighbors with fences, fixing trucks for friends fishing on calm mornings when the fog rolls low. But some nights when I can't sleep, I hear it again, the faint sound of air moving through trees, rhythmic, steady. I used to tell myself it was the wind. Lately, I'm not so sure. Maybe it's just memory. Maybe it's the land talking back. People ask sometimes if I think Lena found what she was looking for. The honest answer is, I don't know. But I think she understood something the rest of us keep forgetting, that there are places older than fear, older than language, and when you walk far enough into them, the silence stops being empty. It becomes something else, something alive. A few months ago, the Park Service sent me a new trail map for review, updated boundaries, revised coordinates all neat and printed. I unfolded it on my kitchen table, tracing the familiar lines with my thumb. When I reached the thoroughfare section, I noticed something small near the margin, a symbol printed faintly beside the restricted zone label. 3 vertical marks through a circle. Probably a mistake, a leftover note from the digital overlay. But it stopped me cold. I sat there for a long time staring at it under the lamplight. Then I folded the map and slid it back into its envelope. I've come to believe that not every story ends in answers. Some end in echoes, moments that follow you long after the investigation closes, long after the names fade from reports. Lena's story is one of those. It lives in the soil, in the wind, in the quiet corners of the map that still resist explanation. If you ever find yourself out there standing on a trail where the world feels too big and too still, listen carefully. You might hear it too, the faint hum under the ground, steady as breath. Whether it's memory or something else, I don't know. But I've learned to treat it like a prayer, not to solve, not to fear, just to remember. Because remembering is what keeps her from vanishing completely. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.